Hello and welcome to Kloeker's Education Foundation, providing quality content for amazing teachers and students. If you're joining us from a previous lesson or previous video, welcome back. And if this is your first time, we're glad you're here. This is our World History series, and this lesson is on the medieval era. Now, before we begin, don't forget to check out the link in the description below for a set of free guided notes to go along with this lesson. While you're there, go ahead and like the video and subscribe to the channel so we can continue to expand our reach more students, and continue to educate. Thank you. So let's dive in. First, we'll talk about the political and economic systems of medieval Europe. And if you haven't checked out our video on the Germanic kingdoms, I recommend checking out that short video right here before going any further. As we've talked about in our previous lesson, Charlemagne's empire was rapidly expanding, and then after his death, his son Louis the Pious will do the best he can to hold on, but with nobles actively rebelling against him, after he dies, his three sons, Charlemagne's three grandsons, will end up splitting the kingdom into West Francia, Middle Francia, and East Francia. Now, during this time, we begin to see raiders coming from the north, Viking raids coming on their famous longships across the North Sea into not just Anglo-Saxon England, but into the Frankish lands as well. It is these Viking raiders from the north and the Muslim advancers from Anadolus in the south that is going to pave the way for the feudal system, making it necessary to fund and equip an army because that is expensive and very complex. Let's break down feudalism. Now, feudalism is the reciprocal military obligations between members of the warrior nobility in medieval Europe. That is the king, the nobles, and the knights. Now, the king is at the top of this, and he, of course, gives land and wealth to the nobles because they have supported him, or he wants them to support his reign, and in return he asks for their loyalty in order to keep these lands. Now the nobles are just one family. They might be very small, they might be very large. These nobles, these lords, will grant pieces of land, parcels of land, known as fiefs, to knights in return for military service. So they are effectively army recruiters offering land in return for military service. Now there's a moral system known as chivalry during this time, and it's very important to have loyalty between the knights and their nobles, and of course the nobles and their king. This loyalty and this moral system of chivalry is going to basically guide the entire civilization or society of Western Europe during this time. To summarize this, a king is going to give land and money or aid to lords and vassal in return for service. The vassal is going to give land and food to the knights. Thus, he is raising his own little private military. In return for their service, they'll get land from the lord. And then the knight is going to protect peasants, the farming, the working class, the merchants, in return for them of working the land, raising the food, and of course, money. Because the knight cannot both be in the fields farming and training to defend the village or off on a war because the king has been drawn into it for some reason. Okay, warning, really big word coming at you. Manorialism. Manorialism. Some people in Texas are going to say manorialism because there's some towns in Texas that are pronounced that way, but no, manorialism. This is the smallest economic unit, the social unit, revolving around an estate. It's controlled by the lord, of course, giving land and protections to the serf. Basically, the lord has gotten land from the king, and he is going to give off small pieces of that to people to work and to serve the Lord. because during this era, land is going to be considered wealth. Ever since the Neolithic Revolution, right, that agricultural revolution, more land is equating to more wealth. The more land you have, the more stature you have. Now, this is important for the medieval era, and we'll see it kind of phase out in the Industrial Revolution, and we'll talk about that when we get there. But during this time, land is wealth, land is power. Now, it's important for the manors to be self-sufficient, meaning they have to be able to produce nearly everything they need for the community. Because trade is inconsistent, there might be raiders, you might be under siege, the person you're trading with might be going through some tough times, and so they have to be able to grow everything themselves. Now, part of this is going to be an open field system, which I'll talk about in just a few moments, where we set aside different pieces of land to grow different crops, and it is going to be very rough on the people who live there. Very rough on the serfs, very rough on the peasants and the working class. This is going to depend on how much land the Lord gets from the king, and of course his status and how many people are underneath him in this hierarchy that is the feudal system. And we see the decline in trade after Rome fell because people are not living in the cities. We spoke about that in our Middle Ages video. We have the barbarian tribes that are invading, and so you have to be self-sufficient. You cannot rely that someone else is going to be able to take care of you or provide a good or service you cannot. So we're going to take a look at some of the specific medieval kingdoms that are developing during this time and some of the challenges, struggles they have, as well as some of the achievements that they have. About English history for a little bit. Now, England during this time was being ruled by the Anglo-Saxons. Okay, this is actually part of the root of where England comes from, of Angloland, from the Anglos. William of Normandy is going to invade, and yes, Normandy is that region in modern-day France, south of the river. They're going to invade England, and in 1066 they defeat the Anglo-Saxon forces at the Battle of Hastings. This is a very important battle because this is the beginning of the Norman rule over England. Very distinctive. If you look at the photo below, they're the ones with the long pointy shields at the bottom. It was very classic Norman military strategy and style. Now, King William is going to be crowned King of England. This is a beginning to blend the Norman upper class and the Anglo-Saxon lower class. And so, different ethnic groups are making up the different social classes within England. We've seen this in other civilizations as well. We saw this in the Muslim caliphates, in our Rise to Islam unit. We saw it in ancient India. Why is this important? Well, if you've ever wondered why when you go to a restaurant, it is ordering a steak or you're ordering a beef hamburger, but then when you look at the animal, you don't say, ooh, that's a beef, you say, that's a cow. When you go to a restaurant, you order pork. But yet when you look at the animal, you don't go, that's a pork, you say, that's a pig. Deer, venison, mutton versus sheep or lamb. Now this is the difference of the classes. The Norman upper class is using a more Latin-based language because they can afford to eat meat, which is very expensive. And the Anglo-Saxon lower class cannot usually afford to eat meat in many cases, and so they are using the more Germanic Anglo-Saxon words to describe the animals, and this is how the English language is getting very, very convoluted. As we travel down the road of English history, we see the rise of Henry II. He is going to be the king that establishes English common law for the whole kingdom. And we begin to see the struggle between the kings and the nobles during this time. If you want a little bit more of a individual look at this, there are many books You can check out, if you're a video gamer, Assassin's Creed Valhalla is based in the time of the Norman, the English and Anglo-Saxon, and all the Vikings coming into England during this era. Continue to travel through English history, we see that in 1215, King John of England is defeated in a civil war by his nobles and forced to sign the Magna Carta. This is a document, one of the first of its kind, with limiting the power of the executive branch, limiting the power of the monarchy, requiring the consent of the nobles or the people to raise taxes, denying royalty the right to unlimited rule. And if he didn't sign it, they were probably going to kill him. This is going to lead to the creation of Parliament, which is going to lead to the establishment of the constitutional monarchy and give the colonists that come to the New World a whole bunch of ideas on self-government. But ideas like no one is above the law, which we saw even back in the ancient Mesopotamian era, representative government, trial by jury, we saw it during the Roman era. These are not new ideas, but they are ideas that are being put together for the first time in many cases. About Charlemagne and how the empire split. Now, we will eventually get a Saxon king, King Otto I, crowned emperor of the Romans in 962, as his kingdom is going to encompass, basically, as you see on the map, modern-day Germany, Austria, Czech Republic, parts of Poland, Switzerland, and Italy, all the way down through Rome. And Otto I is going to be king or emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Yes, they are the ones who keep the names after Charlemagne. And if you are a history buff and you think about World War II and how the Nazi Party was obsessed with the Third Reich or the Third Kingdom, this is the First Kingdom, the First Reich. Now, during the Holy Roman Empire, during this time, Frederick II is going to be expanding through Italy and trying to expand the Holy Roman Empire. But he is slowed down by the fact that powerful lords are declaring themselves independent, and so he constantly has to cycle back and try to subdue city-states. England and France have a strong and unified country, but unfortunately, the Germans and Italians are very opinionated during this time, and there are many independent city-states that declare themselves independent, and the king is going to have to go back, and sometimes they're so small he doesn't go back and squash it until they grow up in power, and then it's like, this is a bigger issue than it needs to be, and leads to several problems for the Holy Roman Empire. Germany and Italy will be fractured for most of European history, especially during this time. In our unit on the rise of Islam, we talked about how the Umayyad Caliphate conquered most of modern-day Spain. By 725, most of Spain is run as Al-Andalus, the Muslim Caliphate. And we can still see the influence on architecture and culture to this day. In 929, a small group of Christians in the northern mountains begin rebelling back against the Muslim Caliphate, and this efforts of the Reconquista or the Reconquest last for generations, ultimately ending in 1492 when King Ferdinand and Queen Isabel expel the last Muslim government and Muslim soldiers out of the Spanish peninsula. And they're the ones who fund Columbus's voyage in the same year, just for perspective. And so when we look at Eastern Europe, we see some similar struggles to those of the Christians in Spain. 700 years it took to drive the Muslim Caliphate out of Hispania. The Eastern Europeans are going to have a similar issue with the Mongols. Now, the Slavic empires, the Slavic people in the East are mostly converting to the Orthodox Church, especially after the Great Schism. We see that St. Cyril has created an alphabet for the Slavic language, 33 letters, known as the Cyrillic alphabet. It's used by the Russians and those languages to this day. We see people settling in Eastern Europe in places like Ukraine, where the Kievan Rus is becoming a mix of Byzantine to the south and the Vikings to the north. We see that the Rus are going to marry into the Byzantine culture, and we see a lot of that culture coming up into Eastern Europe. And again, these people, the Kievan Rus, the Ukrainians, the Poles, the Polish, the Hungarians, they're going to be the ones bearing the brunt of the Mongol invasions into Europe. Now, they'll get to the Holy Roman Empire and they'll get to Rome, but they are the ones who have to bear with it the most. It's not enough to be fighting the Mongols to the east. Religious orders like the German Teutonic Knights will be coming out of the Holy Roman Empire and waging conquest and war into Poland and Russia. Thus, at many times, they end up fighting a war on both sides and fighting religious orders that they are also fighting to defend. Yes, it's very convoluted. Don't know why they did it, but it happened. Now, to give you a little teaser of our power of the church lesson that's coming up, during this time, the Catholic Church is going to be building its power. It's going to reach the height of its power under Pope Innocent III. You see him there pictured on the right. And because they had established for hundreds of years they were higher than kings, queens, and emperors, that if they wanted to, they could exclude a leader from protection of the church. And if you were not a Christian during this time, you could have a lot more excuses and treat someone a lot more terribly than if they were. But not only did it mean that the king couldn't rule, the people below him could at many times almost openly rebel against the king because he was outside of the church. So it was very important to stay within the church and not be excommunicated. And at some points in times, popes have excommunicated entire countries and said, no one in this land is within the protection of the church. Of course, that opens up a lot of justification for conflict and war. We see a rise of religious groups. We'll talk about that more in our lesson on the rise and role of the Catholic Church. Rise of religious groups, cisterns, covenants, the Franciscans, Dominicans, and of course the Spanish Inquisition, which was famously portrayed in British comedy. We'll have a whole lesson solely based on the Crusades, but just to give you another little teaser, it is going to be a series of wars initiated by the Catholic Church when the Byzantine Empire asked for help to fight off the Seljuk Turk and the Muslim advancement into Byzantine territory. And so for about 200 years, this brings Christians, Jews, and Muslims into significant conflict. During this time, Pope Urban II, who will be the pope who declares the First Crusade, will promise salvation in order to attract the knights. So if you have done terrible things in the past, you can get salvation if you fight for God in this crusade. Many had religious motivations. Many had financial motivations for participating. But it was an effort to defend the Byzantine from Muslim advancements and retake lands that were once Christian. Christian Syria, Christian Israel, Christian Palestine. These were all Christian lands prior to 600 AD with the rise of Islam. And so some crusaders are going to be ruthless. They're going to attack communities, whether they're Muslim or Jewish communities. They're going to attack Jews in Europe as well. And even on the Fourth Crusade, due to some poor leadership and some treason, they will destroy and sack the city of Byzantium on their way to, quote, fight in the Holy Land. And this, of course, starts a series of wars. And again, we have a whole lesson on the crusade, but it is going to definitely weaken the power of the Pope by declaring these crusades. It's going to weaken the feudal system and the nobility, because people after the First and Second Crusade are less inclined to go and fight. We see that many are going to get incredibly wealthy, especially the Italians, merchant fleets from Venice, Rome, and all throughout the Mediterranean. And in the Fourth Crusade, we will see the army beginning to fight and attacking the city of Constantinople, which they were on their way to defend. Crusades are not particularly successful for Christians. It exposed a lot of trade and culture between the Christian and the Muslim trade network. It helps fuel the age of exploration because the conflicts are going to make it difficult to travel, and with the jihads and the holy wars that are fought in counterswing to the Crusades, many Christian nations will not want to travel through Muslim nations, even if they are at peace. This is, of course, sparking the age of exploration. And you can see, just looking at this, the First Crusade was 1096. The last crusade ended in 1204. That's almost 200 years of conflict. That's about 7 generations that Crusader states have lasted within the Christian lands. And you can see, even from the map, especially on the coast of the Mediterranean, most of those lands were Christian prior to the expansion of Islam. And so if you missed that link on the previous slide, you can go back and click it. The medieval era is going to be quite a unique time, often again referred to as the Middle Ages, when things are not so bad. We see there is the feudal system, the knights, the lords. There is a famous Hollywood motion picture known as A Knight's Tale. It is heavily Hollywoodized and dramatized. There is a little bit of historical accuracies as far as chivalry and how people carried themselves, but not the actual events of the movie. After the Crusades, we had cultural diffusion. Now, when people are coming back, we see the development of Gothic architecture. The best way I can describe this, if you look at old churches from the medieval era, Middle Ages, they are very often grand, pointy, where everything is pointing up into the heavens. Church spires, you can see Notre Dame Cathedral, very grand. Things are pointing up, focusing your eyes up towards the heavens, as compared to the Greek and Islamic styles, where things are more rounded and more grounded. Vaulted ceilings, flying buttresses make them even more grand. We see a reemergence of learning. Universities begin to be created. Theology is usually the most emphasized topic, but we see a new style of balancing faith and reason becoming known as Scholasticism. This is, of course, where we get the word scholar and all of the derivatives. Thomas Aquinas being one of the leaders of this movement. He is a very important figure as far as public education goes. Thomas Aquinas was also a priest and very influential with church writings and scholars. We begin to see books being published as literacy goes up, and books are not just being published in English, but in the vernacular, which means the everyday local language. So the elites may speak Latin, but they speak French. The books are being published in French. The Canterbury Tales being one of the first examples, where instead of being published in Latin, like most books were, they were published in English, Old English. Now this is a 1,000-year period, which makes it very easy to break into different pieces and sections, and so that's why we have different videos focused in on it. In the late Middle Ages, we see that the Earth is going through a cooling period, a little mini ice age, if you will. Not like, the movies, but famine and hunger are hitting. We see crops are failing. We see plagues coming in, such as the Black Death or the bubonic plague coming in, decimating Europe. They are brought in on trade ships and trade routes on the fleas of rats, which makes it very difficult because germ theory is not really a thing during this time. In 1351, 75 million people have estimated to die. Some cities have lost 50%, some cities and towns have been completely wiped out, and some cities and towns have hardly been touched at all. Some cities in Italy were completely decimated and kept their doors closed and would not allow people in, and some cities like Milan had only lost 3% of their population and kept their doors open to the public. We see that kings are trying to establish their authority over the church, especially after the Crusades. They try to tax some of the churches. There's a big controversy with the church when the French rigged the papal election in order to get a French pope because they want to have more control and influence on the church. And when the French pope dies, the French refuse to recognize the new pope, and this is known as the Great Schism. And so we see a lot of the separation between church and state. The church loses a lot of its power. We begin to see the French, despite they are or were a Catholic majority nation, the French begin to pull away from the authority of the papacy. Is a major war in Europe between the French and the English as they both claim a duchy, the Duchy of Gascony. The war begins in 1337 over this region, and the different styles of war makes this very difficult. The French use heavily armored knights, while the English are paying peasants and archers, and change the name of warfare throughout this time. This 100 Years' War ends in 1453 when the French technically win. And prior to World War II, the French were the winningest military in human history. That moral code, social order we talked about with chivalry of how people were supposed to carry themselves and do right and all these things, the English archers kind of threw that out the window. Generally, during the war, if you're a knight and you are hurt and you're injured and you yield, you're basically taken as a prisoner of war by the other side. You're supposed to be shown mercy. If you're a peasant, as soon as the knights reach your position, you're not really supposed to fight them. You're supposed to lay down your arms and be taken as a prisoner of war. The English said, "Nah, man, we're not playing those rules no more. New phone, who dis?" And so when the French knights arrived at the battalion of archers at the Battle of Agincourt, after being mowed down for about 1,000 yards of mud, they get there expecting the English archers to lay down their weapons, and these little rapscallions then pull out daggers and swords and just start ripping the French knights to bits. And so that battle itself is known as the death of chivalry. It's also a change from using heavy-duty infantry to more of a ranged infantry. But again, the whole real point of warfare during this time is I have something sharp and I want to hit you with it or stab you with it. And the French put metal on to protect themselves. The English said, "Oh, what if I just throw this really sharp thing or shoot it over there?" All of that style of warfare can be seen in the Hollywood blockbuster film Robin Hood. There's a bunch of them, but the one in my mind specifically is the one with Russell Crowe, because they are fighting the French and then they leave to come back to England. So we can see the development and the importance of archery in those films. Now, the French after the war imposed the taille, which is a tax on land Very controversial. The rich did not like it. They just fought a major war. Lots of the nobles and knights died, and now they're paying an exorbitant amount of land. Also, if you're a devout Catholic, had the issues with the Catholic Church. Not a great time for the French. The English endure a civil war known as the War of the Roses. Now, this is where Henry Tudor emerges victorious and puts his family in the line of English monarchy. If you've seen the show Game of Thrones, it's loosely inspired by the events of the War of the Roses with a lot of the things that go on. And it's also inspired by some of the events with the Russians and the Mongols. Specifically, I'm talking about the White Walkers and the wildlings and all that. The battle on ice where they come down and they crack the ice and everyone falls down to the bottom of it, that was a real thing done by the Russians versus the Mongols. Now, Spain during this time is reunified under Isabella and Ferdinand. They've driven out the caliphate from Spain and then begin driving out the Muslim and the Jewish people from Spain. The Holy Roman Empire has been shattered by all the city-states. You can see how jacked up that map is. And yes, the red line was technically the authority of the Holy Roman Empire, but all of the city-states made that not so. And that is going to be ruled by the Habsburgs. We'll talk about more in a later lesson. And during this time, we saw Ivan IV, or Ivan the Terrible, defeat the Mongols and begin driving them back. We'll have a whole lesson specifically devoted to the Mongols, a whole unit devoted to them. And that wraps up our lesson. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you so much for watching. I know this was a long one. Please, if you enjoyed this video or found it helpful, don't forget to like and subscribe. Check us out on Teachers Pay Teachers, YouTube, Rumble, and the Kloeker Education Foundation website. We have a ton of lessons and a ton of resources that might be helpful for you. See what's new and what's next in our series. Click here as we continue to break down the power of the church, the Crusades, as we break down the Mongols and get into the Renaissance. For something you might like, click here. And to subscribe to our channel, click here on the right. All of this and more is just a click away. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.